Hello and welcome to a special edition to the War Report. This has been a long time in the making. We have a guest with us today. He is from Russia, a topic we cover greatly. We'll be discussing the constitutional reforms and wherever that conversation takes us, maybe a little bit in the pipelines, but we covered a lot of that last episode, so maybe not so much this time, but we have with us, you may recognize him, you may have seen him around. GSP. No. Vile Varangian. Uh,
Yeah, hello everyone, and thank you for having me on the show. Nice to be with you.
Thank you for coming. Sorry it took so long, but we're here now.
Yeah, whatever. It only matters that we are finally doing it, so it's all right.
Excellent.
Okay, so are we going to jump into the constitutional reform?
well, if you want to give a little bit of background to yourself, or if you just want to get into it, it's your call.
Well, there are basically two aspects to it. One of it is internal, I'm sorry, is internal Kremlin power politics, which is what part of the constitutional reform or what is Putin's intention for the government that will come after him? What kind of role does he want to play after he can no longer be president because his second term ends in 2024? And he is making some provisions for his own role after that in the new constitution that we are going to get after a referendum next month. If the majority of the people vote for it, of course, which probably will be the case, I mean, come on, elections in Russia, yeah, sure. Okay, so anyway, that's the one aspect. The other one is our Russian constitution is notorious for being very, at least among nationalists and right-wingers, for being a horrible occupationist constitution. Essentially, I usually compare it with the German and the Japanese one, because it was written by basically Western advisors after the Soviet Union collapsed in the worst traditions of Western liberalism. Now, is that going to change entirely with the new constitution? No, not entirely. A lot of provisions that are kind of liberal, kind of cucked will still remain. For example, the main issue is that the Russian constitution doesn't refer to the Russian people as ethnic Russians, but as a multinational people. I think that's not going to change.
A nation of immigrants, if you will.
Yeah, kind of. It's a proposition. Yeah, it's something like that. I mean, there have been suggestions by the people who are on the committee for the constitutional reform to include the ethnic Russian people in the constitution, but it's unlikely that it's going forward. Like I say, 90% that this one will not change. But anyway, other provisions will change, which is pretty crucial. For example, one of them is that Russian law, in the current constitution, Russian law is inferior to international law. So international law, according to the current constitution, always overrules Russian national law, which is basically, again, an occupationist statute, I would say. It's a statute that limits our sovereignty, which is ridiculous in the current day and age. And that is going away. We already know that. Then there have been other conservative propositions for the new constitution, like, for example, the Orthodox Church, and that is probably going to happen, actually, is pushing for including in the constitution that marriage is between a man and a woman, so that excludes any legal possibility of gay marriage or things like that happening in the future, at least, without further constitutional changes. So that would be quite nice. And let me think. Well, that's about the main things, at least. So I'm in support of the new constitution that's going to come, simply because it will replace some of the worst parts of the Yeltsinist constitution. And then, as far as Putin is concerned, he intends the power of the presidency. After he is gone, the power of the presidency will be more limited than it is right now, because right now the executive is by far the strongest branch in the Russian government. I think according to the new constitution's constitution, the Duma will in future assign ministers, for example, instead of the president.
So more of a parliamentary system akin to most European
yes,
countries.
exactly. And he himself will go probably into the upper chamber of the parliament or something like that, as a speaker or whatever, and he will remain as in an advisory role in the government. Some people, for example, you should read Anatoly Karlin, who is the best English language blogger about Russia. He has a blog on the UNS Review, great guy. He wrote that Putin is probably aspiring to something like a senior statesman role. So basically, like he compared him to Lee Kuan Yew, or how you pronounce it. I think it's not Jew, right? So the guy in Singapore, anyway. So something like that. I'm relatively critical of this particular change because I'm not a fan of parliamentarism. I think we should actually leave most of the power to the executive because that's the most, for lack of a better word, the most democratic way of government, because the people are most closely have the strongest levers over the presidency and not over the judiciary or the legislative or whatever. So actually, I think the strong presidential republic, it works quite well as a system, but Putin wants to provide for his own future, and he probably will retire into the parliament, so he's giving more power to that structure, which I don't know, I'm iffy on that. I think in the long term, that's probably a bad decision, in my personal opinion.
And there we have the first defense of democracy on the War Report. Wasn't expecting that one today.
I mean, democracy is all right if your people is all right.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. Certain
like, I mean, democracy in, let's say, the Netherlands is bad because the Dutch are cucked, but democracy in, I don't know, Poland or Russia is probably quite good if you actually let people decide.
You know where democracy works fantastically?
In Israel. Okay.
Okay. 70 governments in 75 years. Great track.
Yeah, sure.
I got to shoehorn that in.
Come on, have you like read Machiavelli? I mean, their monarchies weren't as long-lasting either.
fair enough. Dysfunctional people, dysfunctional government. I see the bit of a correlation there. You know, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but let's see. You brought up Putin, so I figure I'm obligated to ask: is he the greatest leader Russia has ever had? Is he aspiring to reestablish the Soviet Union, or is he a Jewish puppet? Because those are the three prevailing narratives.
Gee, do I only have like these three options?
No, go ahead. But I just had to.
Let me think. Okay, he is certainly not the greatest leader Russia ever had. I'm hard pressed to think of who I would actually name to be the greatest leader Russia ever had. Probably Alexander the First. But whatever. Tsar Alexander I is pretty based. Anyway, does he want to rebuild the Soviet Union? Of those three options that you have given me, it's probably the most likely, at least in terms of geopolitics. I would say yes. Russia is working on restoring old Soviet prestige, you could say, in the world. You could see this with the intervention in Syria, for example, or Russia generally positioning itself as a new power broker in, let's say, the Middle East or Africa. Or what was the last? Is he a Jewish puppet? To some degree, yes. To the largest degree, no, I would say. Like, there are Jews who have influence in Russia. I wouldn't say that Putin is like ideologically anti-Semitic or something like that. We have also seen that when he recently basically accused Poland of starting World War II because they were like bigger anti-Semites than Hitler or something like that. It was a pretty stupid step from him. I was very critical of that. But nonetheless, like if we look, for example, at Russia's overarching policy since the 90s, Jewish influence has waned in Russia very strongly because some of the main oligarchs basically got imprisoned or had to emigrate, and their assets were seized by the state. You can see that with Berezovsky, you can see that with Khodorkovsky, of course. And then now, since Russia has regained the ability to project military power, our foreign policy is largely not entirely hostile to Zionism, but at least opposed to its interests, or it has different interests in certain regions. For example, you can see that with Syria. I think the state of Israel is very, very unhappy with the Russian force being stationed in Syria and basically propping up the very hostile government of Bashar al-Assad. I think they're very unhappy with that. Then they were also very unhappy with us taking back Crimea, essentially, after they staged this gay-up coup in Ukraine. They hoped to get our fleet out of Sevastopol and things like that. So if you look at geopolitics, no, I think Benjamin Netanyahu is not very happy with Putin, but nonetheless, like, Jews still have some power in Russia. I'm not going to deny that.
I think everyone can agree that's a fair conclusion. I just bring that up because there's a lot of the sentiment that he's just the total like Zionist puppet. Who's that guy you were telling me about, GSP? The Soviet Israel did 9/11 guy?
Yeah, Soviet Russia, Israel did 9/11.
It's a great Twitter account. I recommend everyone to follow him. Yeah. I mean, it's extremely funny. It's as if like Alex Jones was a Russophobe and an anti-Semite at the same time, kind of content. It's pretty funny. So I like that guy, actually. Usually it's like the guys who say that Russia doesn't differ at all in terms of Zionist control over it from, let's say, the United States are usually neo-Nazis from the Baltic republics or something like that.
Yeah. It's cope. It's just major cope. It's cope because they could never enact a law that would state marriage is strictly between a man and a woman. They could never even imagine doing something like that because I guess for them, it doesn't matter that Russia doesn't send $3.5 billion a year as aid to Israel, or that didn't support the jihadis that wanted to oust Assad. It's like it's just cope, and we talked about this on the show several times in the last few weeks. And my feeling was that the reason this is happening is because, well, I mean, Trump's election has not culturally changed anything. In fact, it as a retaliation, it's accelerated it. And so I think a lot of sort of the Baltic Wignats and even Poles and some other people kind of feel this pressure. And when the differences are kind of obvious. Comparing Russia, say, to America and its Western bloc and its grip on NATO countries, I think that's a way for them to kind of minimize the sense of pressure and urgency that's there, and above all, a kind of hopelessness, because the society is just incapable of fighting back. So it is a way of coping with, terrible circumstances, which I can empathize with. But one of the aberrant forms of this cope is to say, well, let's not work with Russia because they're just as bad, when it's obviously not the case.
I'm sorry, but Putin took a picture with a rabbi once. It's no deal, done, over.
Yeah, he's like gone there 3 times in 20 years, and they make it look like it. It's just so ridiculous. Like, you have former general staff Israeli personnel saying that we would prefer ISIS in Syria rather than Assad, but somehow, Putin is still finding ways to, when is that going to happen? And I completely agree with you. Deep down inside, they are very, very unhappy with Russia at the moment. But there's not much that they can do about it. And America is not galvanized for a war with Russia, nor or not even over Syria.
Well, as far as, I'm not strictly a Putinist or whatever, but the criticisms of Putin that go in this image board fashion, where you show some random picture of him standing next to a rabbi, or you show a random drone picture, or not exactly random, but a drone picture of Moscow during Ramadan, let's say, and you see all these praying Muslims, and then you say, look, Russia is, committing white genocide, just like all the other countries in Europe.
You forgot the other big one, abortion stats from the 90s.
Yeah, or that, or that. But the biggest one, or the one that's really the most stupid, really, is the one with the praying Muslims in Moscow. I always get mad when someone does that.
I
It's
know.
an easy way to trigger me, simply because it's stupid, not because because I'm okay. I am mad about so many Muslims being in Moscow. That's true, but because the argumentation is so stupid. Because you know the entire city of Moscow now, I believe, has 4 mosques in total, and it's the
Yeah.
biggest city in Europe. It has 16 million people, and the argumentation of the city administration goes like this: like, we have a number of Muslims which the capacity of the mosques that we do have cannot serve, but all those people are not meant to stay here. They are guest workers that are on rotation and usually go back within like 3 years or so when their contract expires. Of course, new ones come in, but they never get a foothold in Russia. They're not founding families here. They usually go back. They come here to send remittance money back to their actual family back at home and things like that. Whereas in the West, and they've lived for a while in the West, even small cities, like I can tell you, I lived in a small German city with 18,000 people for many years, and it had a mosque, actually, like 18,000 people, a city in Central Europe. Just imagine that the entirety of St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg has, I think, 6 million people, has 1 mosque exactly, and actually that's a historical mosque that was built during Tsarist times or something like that. They didn't even build a new one. So that
Right.
the argumentation of showing just some picture that makes Russia look bad without explaining any of the backgrounds, like the most stupid trope that's out there. Like, people need to be careful with that.
Right. And I think ultimately what this comes down to is the two kind of varying perspectives that I think are much more clear now than they were in 2016. And that is the idea that the West can be saved, and the idea, or the contrary idea, both are in the dissident right, that the West cannot be saved. Both seek ways to make life better for the founding stock of Western civilization. On that, they don't disagree with, but on what they do disagree is whether it can be saved or not. And I would say there are some that think it can, and for those, ultimately, these apple to oranges comparisons. For instance, how many mosques are there in Boston? A city that's 2, maybe 3 million compared to 16 million. I can assure you, there's well over 100 mosques. So
Wait. So you're telling me Trump's not going to save the West?
Right. So I think that ultimately is what drives these ideas, is that a restoration of the West has to happen because, Russia and China are just rubbing their grubby little palms, waiting for the whole system to collapse, and they'll swoop in. But the difference is this, and that is that America represents a kind of global ideology, an ideology that more or less has found a way to fit itself even into cultures and civilizations that are profoundly different than it. They've accepted it on some level. Japan is a good example of this. Some amount of cultural autonomy is preserved, but none of these countries are even remotely what they would have looked like 100 years ago. And this is kind of like a testament of the kind of global reach of the Western idea of liberal democracies. What I argue is that Russia and China do not have a global ideology. They don't offer a system that can be tuned on a global level. Ultimately, their systems are for Russians first, then for Chinese first. And in that way, there's no conflict of identity. But more so that, let's say, for instance, Russia or China wanted to take over certain areas that are either, not Russian or not Chinese. Well, you don't have a kind of global ideology the way the West has, where the definition of a citizen is highly abstracted. It's not based on an ethnicity. To say nothing of how many centuries it took to actually get to this moment for the West, and the groundwork that was laid by Britain in the first place. So I think they underestimate that, the crowd that thinks like we're gonna save the West, and here's another reason why, and Russia's no better. Stop looking to them for inspiration. That's my thought on it. And also Russia isn't it's not interested in saving the West anyways. So
I think as far as Western nationalist discourse is concerned, one of the things that's the most frustrating is the lack of understanding for hard power, like really hard military power. How many tanks do you have and where are they, basically? Which is to say that a lot of Western nationalists have the wrong belief that if they vote a certain party into parliament, if they troll Charlie Kirk like really, really hard, then they can change the culture or the politics in their nation. And I think that's wrong. Like, if you want to know the point from where on your country will become more healthy, your culture and people will become more healthy, it's when your country starts leaving NATO. It's the moment when your country starts to diversify its economy away from the EU trading bloc, let's say. If it starts trading more with Russia and China and Iran even. If it chases out all these economic, political and cultural elites. If they leave these blocks that were set up by Western bureaucracies, by Western administrative bureaucracies, and which are ultimately supported by hard power, that's when things are going to get better. But they're not going to get better if, I don't know, in Germany, for example, if the AfD gets 20% in the parliament, it's not going to change anything.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I think I think after Charlottesville, it really did hit me. And that is like, I finally because I was swept up by the Trump election, the Trump victory. I actively pushed for him on YouTube. I joined Twitter, I think a day or two after he won the election. I mean, a lot of it was just salt mining, just to see liberals cry, but it was more than that, right? Because I thought now that there was, based on his rhetoric, I thought that there was a chance. And I think after Charlottesville, even with Trump's kind of, tacit admission that not everyone on the right was an evil Nazi, I kind of put to, as others had done before me. There's nothing unique about what occurred to me, but, I began to think about what amount of Americans are actually of European stock or identify as, white Americans, to use another term. And, it's 62%, some say 60, some say 65. I don't know what it is in 2020, but
56, I've heard.
What's that?
56, I've heard.
I see what you did there. So, let's say about 45% of that votes Democrat. And so, now you're left with what? 32 million? How much of that is women? Like, even if you account for 1 or 2% of the women taking part in a reclamation, American Reconquista, let's say you've got 33% of the population. Of that, how many do you have that are able, that are let's say 35 or 40 and under? And now you're literally under 20 million, under 15 million. And then how much of that is right wing or even Republican? Well, very few, maybe 10 million. And 10 million in a highly diverse country of 350 million is just not going to cut it. That 10% rule does not apply to a highly diverse country. And I think that it dawned on me then, and I mean, it still took months for me to accept it, because I despise the politics, the woke politics, and the kind of hate that they have for people of European descent living in North America.
Yeah, now we support Biden.
My acceleration is
Or
candidate.
what's the based Jewish banker? I forgot his name. Like the one who is against blacks and
Bloomberg?
says, yeah, Bloomberg. Like he is an HBD realist. Vote for him. He knows about the 13 to 50% rule. He
Yeah,
knows about
Yeah,
it.
Bloomberg
I
is
see
the kind of
that.
guy who calls him Schwarz in private. I guarantee it.
Totally.
Yeah,
No,
so I thought, like, at that moment, I kind of knew, and I think this is why, to answer, this is the longest, long-winded answer ever. I think that's, on some level, that's why they know that they cannot have hard politics in America. I think deep down inside, they know they don't have the numbers.
Well, as far as America is concerned and whether it's savable, I simply don't want to publicly blackpill white Americans because I'm going to be accused of being a KGB PSYOP agent or whatever.
You did yourself in when you agreed to come on the show, so just go ahead.
Okay, sure. Maybe I might as well do it. But because I personally think I admire the people in America who are keeping up the fight, or despite being repressed, and a lot of people are even in prison after things like Charlottesville without being guilty, who keep fighting for their people in their country. I admire them absolutely, but I don't know whether they have, much of a future there. To be honest, like if I was a patriotic white American, let's say a red-pilled white American, I probably would advise people like me people like this to immigrate basically to a country in Europe where they can make themselves useful. That's not entirely lost yet, basically, because if yeah, basically that's like that. But okay, sorry, I'm lost.
No, it's fine. This happens all the time. But I'm glad through the long-windedness of this got brought up, because I'm not gonna bore you with talks of U.S. internal politics or elections or any of the stuff going on there. But uh, what are your thoughts on Donald Trump? And I think I know the answer to this question, but I'll throw it out there anyway. What are your thoughts on American global hegemony, and how long do you see it lasting?
That's a good question. As far as Donald Trump is concerned, I was exactly like GSP. I was enthralled with him in 2016. I thought his rhetoric was revolutionary, but then later, fortunately for me, I realized it quite soon. I jumped off the Trump train once he attacked Syria. And that happened like 2 months into the presidency, I think.
Well, every Russian I talk to tells me that exact story. It's wild.
Yeah, so I instantly knew, okay, things are going to be back to usual. Because before Trump, I was extremely cynical about American politics, and I'm extremely cynical again, where I think that elections in America, they don't matter. I made a joke before that about Russian elections. Ours do matter, but you often know the result way ahead because we have a more homogeneous society. But American elections, even if the outcomes are different, the final policies that will be enacted are always the same. And then I realized that Trump was basically my Obama, because before that I knew like European shit lips. When Obama first was a candidate in 2008, they were extremely hyped up about him, like, oh, he's promising change, he's going to end the wars, he's going to socialize the economy and things like that. So they were very, very white pilled, and then they got black pilled after also about like 2-3 years, when they noticed, okay, nothing is changing. Like America is still the warmonger it always was. It still is a hyper-capitalist economy and things like that. And then I realized, okay, Trump was just my Obama, because I was blackpilling these liberals extremely hard. I was telling them, like, you have all these hopes, but he's just a PR figure to remedy the bad image of Bush, but he's going to do all the same things. I was blackpilling them all the time. And then eventually, a few years later, they told me, yeah, you were right. And then about Trump, they did the same thing to me. Like, oh, you think this guy is going to change anything? He's like a New York billionaire. Like, what are you, retarded? And I'm like, no, he's the great God emperor who will save white people. And then, like, after the Syria strikes, I'm like, yeah, okay, whatever.
Look, I for one still have I put a lot of stock in President Kushner there. I think he can do a lot of great things.
Yeah, for Israel, sure.
Of course, of course. What else might I be referring to?
Yeah, so then the other question was, what do I think about US geopolitical hegemony, right? Let me think about it. Like, of course, I'm highly opposed to it. Basically, I think the way out will be for the US to collapse. That is not a very interesting novelty take, because it's basically also a cope. Like, I'm one of these people who think that, I'm a what do you call this, like collapse. I'm just waiting for collapse,
An
whatever.
accelerationist.
Yeah, an accelerationist is a good word. So I think the only reason for the liberal world to exist as it exists right now is literally American hard power. I think in the US elite works in more complex ways, because the US elite is totally infiltrated by Jews. But the thing is, in the United States is basically like the second Israel, or the bigger Israel, because they have half of the entire globe's Jewish population. I believe 6 million people live in Israel, and then there are 6 million Jews in the United States. So there they have like the physical numbers to fill up every important position of power, every single important professorship in universities, all the media CEOs, all the financiers of politicians and stuff like that. They have the numbers to occupy the entire administrative apparatus. But that's not the way in Europe. Europe still has relatively good demographics, like most even hyper like European countries with open borders, hyper immigrationist liberal countries.
Sweden's still 90% like Swedish.
Yes, they still have very high numbers of white people, and they have very few little numbers of Jews. So they entirely rely on bad guys who will carry out commands from overseas. And that entire system rests on American military power being present in Europe, especially in Germany, which is basically an occupied country. So once American troops start moving out of Europe, once there is no longer this transatlantic world order, I think that's when things are going to change for Europe. So the way to liberate Europe is basically to destroy the US empire. That's my opinion. And I'm totally open to any power that will help us accomplish that. So I'm a big fan of China. I'm a big fan of Iran. I'm a big fan even of North Korea. Not to say that, I would want Russian people to be governed by the wisdom of Kim Il-sung and his Juche philosophy. I mean, there are worse things, but whatever. I'm not a fan of Juche, but, like North Korea as a geopolitical power, as a nuclear power that blocks U.S. interests in the Pacific, yeah, sure, go ahead. I'm supporting any power that helps us bring down the U.S. empire, basically, because it's the cancer cell that eats up everything that I personally value.
So you brought up that it was mainly American military power that keeps the world order in check, which I agree to an extent. But in terms of influence over Europe, couldn't you argue it's more economic power? And I would go even further to say that it's becoming ever more increasingly relying on military power, as we see with they're going to open up Fort Trump in Poland, supposedly at some point. But at this point, I would say the threat of sanctions, as we see with some of the energy deals and dealings with Iran, are more of a threat than just the U.S. military presence there. I think the U.S. military presence there is sort of the last straw. Like, I don't see in any sane scenario, barring a massive black swan event, something that would just completely turn things on their head, the U.S. threatening a European country inside the European Union with military force.
The military is not, well, the military isn't enforcing a hard regime on the governments of Europe, but it's there as how do you say it, last resort, basically.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at.
Yes, exactly. But it's also, you can say that Europe's dependency on the United States is economic, because Europe has a lot of options to diversify its economy away from the United States, more towards China, Asia, India, Russia, Iran. Even Iran is a big market of 80 million people, and still they sanction it on demands from the United States. And European economy itself is quite, it could be relatively autarkic, even if let's say there was a based version of the European Union, then it could even be autarkic, because it's such a huge market in and of itself. I don't think it's only economic. I think the world order we currently witness started after 1945, and the difference between 1945 and any year before that is the presence of the American military on the European continent. So that gave them the opportunity to install the elites that they wanted, and to continue keeping them in power.
Yeah,
Of
I suppose
course, I
that
don't
happens
think
when you neuter the defense. For example, Germany's still under all these arms treaties. I know it's Asia, but Japan, and to the point where, is there any European country outside of the UK or France, and that's even pushing that field that has a significantly sized navy that could even come close to challenging the United States? Any ground force that could come close to challenging the United States aside from that in Russia? I can't think of any.
Yes, exactly. And I don't think that, like the moment the American military withdraws from Europe, the entire system will collapse. Okay, like maybe it will, because a lot of things need to change before that happens, of course, right? But let's say spontaneously tomorrow, every single American soldier withdraws from European soil. It's not exactly going to change overnight. But then what it will mean is that Europe, in terms of power projection, will be open to, first of all, outside players like Russia will be able to influence Europe much more, as well as other players, of course. And it will also give the European people themselves much more power over their own governments, which will eventually crystallize into a change of the system. Because currently, again, in terms of hard power, the current world order is being backed up by the US military as a final boss, so to speak, that you can't overcome by means of soft power before the military occupation is removed.
And that segues perfectly into my next point. Now, GSP and I can say, have become somewhat fans of one Emmanuel Macron in France, and how he conducts himself in both European and global politics, playing sort of the wild card role. Do you see him as a real chance to, I wouldn't necessarily say turn Europe into its own bloc, but to shake American hegemony in Europe, present the most real challenge there's been in decades to it, or is it all just a show?
I'm torn on that. I'm like a big Francophile civilizationally. I think the perfect order for continental Europe would be a Franco-Russian alliance, basically. Or
Well, I think we've seen that one before. I think that's happened before.
yeah,
Yikes.
that kind of did happen, yeah. But anyway, like I have this really esoteric novelty take where I'm against the Germans, basically, but I don't want to go into that. So, okay, France, okay. Macron, I'm torn on him because he's the only European politician who is at least saying any interesting things, but that's an old, long-standing French tradition. Like, I put much more hope in France for being an agent of change in Europe than into any other country. Because, first of all, in terms of their elites as well as in terms of their people, like, if you look at French politics, let's say on the elite level, things happen there that never happened anywhere else, like not in Germany or in Britain. Like France was the only European country that managed for a short period of time to actually quit NATO after the Second World War, and who had sovereigntist tendencies. So that's very interesting, actually. And then if you look at the French people, they're also the only ones who are capable of mounting like a real uprising, as we see with the Yellow Vests, because everything that's going on in other European countries is extremely disappointing. As I told you before, like if you look at Germany, people are putting high hopes there because some neoliberal party that's like against Muslims is getting 20% of the votes or something like that. But it's the Germans are still extremely docile. They are not doing anything. Whereas the French, they're basically at a point where one Black Swan event needs to happen, and they're storming the Élysée Palace. Basically, that's the one thing. Then even the British, they had this grooming scandal where they basically know that their own children are unprotected on the streets and they're just sucking up everything. They're not rioting in the streets. They're not doing anything. The French have much more revolutionary potential, and they have much more interesting elites like Macron, who is going against the stream in reaching out to Russia, in thinking about creating a European security architecture that would not really involve the United States, or that would turn Europe into a more sovereign bloc of nations, basically. That's a very interesting thought. But then on the other hand, we must not forget that the guy is literally a former Goldman Sachs banker and an extreme neoliberal who also speaks of, what's it called, Francafrique or whatever. So where he basically wants to to also unite France with their former colonies in Africa and things like that. And he has, he has done and said a lot of cucked things, but also he's the only one who's saying anything interesting. Like Merkel, for example, is not interesting at all. She's just an automaton, basically. She does nothing except carrying out the orders of global homo. So there is no independent thought in Germany, in the German political landscape, much less. And the same is true for Britain, but France, interesting things are happening there. History is happening in France, I would say. And if we are going to see big changes, they will also come from France. That's my opinion.
Excellent. And that sort of segues, again, right into my next point here about the sort of populist wave rising in Europe. And you pretty much said in that previous segment, you see France as really the only potential agent for change with its revolutionary sentiments amongst people. I'm assuming you think that the populist wave in both Southern and Eastern Europe are either in countries that are too dysfunctional or have too little power projection to make any significant change?
You're right about the power projection. What is also very white-pilling about France is that France is a nuclear power with an actually capable military. As I said before, I don't think that everything rests on hard power, right? But I think hard power is an aspect that's often very, very underestimated in right-wing discourse. People are not really talking, again, about, I like the Stalin quote, how many divisions does the Pope have, right? Because I like to look at material realities sometimes. And France actually has the capability to declare its own sovereignty and break out of this bloc and declare an independent foreign policy, for example. They have the physical capabilities to back that up. Whereas my favorite example to look down on is Germany again. The German military basically doesn't exist. It's like a gay club that has some weapons and traditional costumes or whatever. Like the German military doesn't exist. It's extremely retarded. Germany can
Now, I would like to hear you say that to those 4 combat-ready fighter jets.
Well, but Germany can be overrun by Poland in 2 weeks. I'm just going to tell you straight up. I know people in the German military. The situation there is extremely dire. Like Russia's military wasn't as bad as the German one right now, even in the 90s. Like Germany, it's and complete occupied colony. Forget about Germany. The Germans are not going to do anything interesting. Like change is not going to come from Germany. Germany is successfully colonized. But France does have potential. Now for the countries of the Visegrad group, for example, well, they have interesting opportunities, I would say, if they manage to again change some hard power realities. Being based within the EU, I think, is worthless, essentially, because you need to actually form the Visegrad group bloc. You need to go out of the European Union. You need to go out of NATO. Then you need to form your own military and your own economic policy, and you need to diversify towards Russia, towards China, still trade with Western Europe, of course. But you need some material realities for your politics to become independent. And I'm a bit black-pilled about that, simply because, the Eastern Europeans or the countries of the former Warsaw Pact, They had a great opportunity in 1990 when the Soviet order in Eastern Europe collapsed. They had the opportunity to say, okay, now that we gained our independence, we actually will be independent countries. We are going to have our own economy, we are going to have our own policy, our own currencies, and so forth. But instead, the very first thing all of them did was to instantly negotiate with the Western power bloc to be totally integrated into their system, and they instantly, like that, they had sovereignty for 5 minutes and they instantly surrendered it. They surrendered sovereignty over their borders, they surrendered sovereignty over their economy, they surrendered sovereignty over their military and foreign policy. Like, why the hell are Polish soldiers in Iraq? Can someone tell me that? Can some Pole justify that?
But Saddam had chemical weapons. We had to take him out.
Yeah, so like just by looking at the history of these countries, they're unfortunately, I think, and still actually, I actually think Trump is a big problem in our region in Eastern Europe because
I can imagine.
too many stupid Eastern Europeans are buying in on Trump being, the big conservative change agent or whatever. A lot of Europeans who are not very familiar with American politics, they still think he is based and he's deporting immigrants and whatever. They're just not very well informed because in his rhetoric, he still remains like kind of extravagant, but we all know that he's a cuck actually. But now the Eastern Europeans, like the Poles, they have reason to put hope into America again. Although they do not have this reason, but they think they have reason to do it. Although what they need to do is actually reclaim their sovereignty. I think demographically and culturally, they are still good. They have some opportunities to, realize that their future is not with the neoliberal system and change this. I think it's possible in the Eastern European parts of the European Union. But again, looking at their history, I'm a bit black-pilled.
I'd like to sort of veer a little bit with this subject because just to start things off, the economic report for the EU in the first quarter for 2020 doesn't look good, and we know about the troubles with, say, for instance, with Deutsche Bank, and it's predicted, for instance, that China's economy is going to slow down, and the heavy investment that the EU has already had with China, particularly Germany, is going to have very negative effects that are going to be felt definitely by mid or late 2020. And I bring this up not because of where those insights would naturally lead people, but to the question of like the EU and the strength of the EU's, say, cultural narrative. Because I think with most people, their beef with it is mostly cultural and not necessarily economic. However, I think economic difficulties are often act as the catalyst to change culture. So I'm wondering, like, if a weaker EU in the next 10 years, how can that play for the right in Eastern Europe? Or will they, because I said this in the last episode, that there's a strong probability that what will happen is as the EU begins to crumble, America will see this as an opportunity to insert itself more strongly, but particularly in Eastern Europe, rather than Central and Western Europe. By the way, I don't consider Poland part of Central Europe, even if Poland considers itself. Why? Because for me, Central European also denotes something that's like actually Western, but is not something that is imitating something which is Western. Do you know what I mean? Like the sign language that's used in the West, originates basically with, Germanic and to a lesser extent, Celtic people. And like, I don't see Slavs and Hungarians belonging to that. Like, and now it's not unusual for a separate culture to imitate the more powerful civilization next to it. That is indeed what happens all the time. However, it's like a cultural pseudometamorphosis, basically, that happens, right? You borrow someone else's sign language because you don't have one. So, what are your thoughts on like an EU that is actually weaker? Because Americans, some very misguided right wingers, and I would say British right wingers love the idea of a weak EU. And not all of that, I think, is consciously based in the problems that we have. Like, I doubt that the EU or Brussels, for instance, holds the keys to the promulgation of tranny reading hour. I maybe they're a close second, but they're not the first. And like Britain leaving the EU is not going to mean less migrants and the closing down of gay tranny hour. Like, that's not going to happen.
It's probably getting worse, actually, but because they're going to be more integrated into the American cultural sphere. And say about Western Europe, whatever you want, but culturally, it's not even half as degenerate as the United States.
Mm-hmm.
About a weaker European Union, do you think the European Union can become weaker just by itself or fall into an economic depression just by itself? I think if Europe would experience difficulties like that, that would be probably a global trend. So it would also take the United States with it, China, maybe Russia.
Well, that's a good point. That's a good point.
That's just because you said that that would be an opportunity for the United States to insert itself into Europe. Now, let me.
I mean, what makes the U.S. different? Like, I understand that a global turnaround in the economy could would affect probably even America to some degree. It probably already is with Chinese manufacturing and so on, but. Like, America is a country that doesn't have to ever worry about paying back a debt, because ultimately, whether the economy goes up or down, you're still going to have to use the American dollar. Mm-hmm. That's the difference. Yeah. So it's not like any other country in that respect.
Sure, I agree. As for the European Union generally, like in a perfect world, I would actually be pro-European Union, because I think in the 21st century, with all these different poles of power arising, like China and Russia, I don't think that Russia will ever be part of the same political system as the countries of Western Europe, and then the United States, and so forth and so forth. And then, of course, the big demographic changes with sub-Saharan Africa exploding demographically and being projected to be half of the global population by 2050 and whatever. The concept of the nation state is maybe not quite suitable to face the challenge. So a lot of European powers in an ideal world would be good. But as things stand right now, I think the EU becoming weaker will be a net positive, especially now. We don't even need to wait for an economic downturn or for anything change in terms of US policy. Now that Britain has actually finally left the bloc, that's going to be a very interesting development, because Britain was the second largest, after Germany, the second largest contributor economy to the European Union. And now that has fallen away, that gives less incentives for all these Eastern European countries who rely on subsidies a lot to stay within the structure. And then if the European Union starts disintegrating, the problem right now is that within the European Union, there exist two Europes, because I personally am of the opinion, you were speaking before that about whether Poland belongs to Central or to Eastern Europe. I think there is a huge cultural divide in Europe, which a lot of people don't actually quite realize, which still goes along the borders of the former Warsaw Pact, or along the border of the Berlin Wall, you could say. I could even go as far as to call Eastern Germans part of Eastern Europe, because that's a kind of cultural geography or political geography, not so much, not so much in terms of actual geography, of a better word. So what am I meaning is, you cannot, like, despite all efforts, I don't think that the countries east of the Berlin Wall are very well integrated into the overall European structure. That's my main issue. And yeah, I think they're integrated as a kind of economic colonies, and sorry, I lost my thought again. Okay. I think that for Eastern Europe to regain its dignity, basically, it has to become an independent bloc, because we are now at a point where the cultural differences between Eastern and Western Europe are irreconcilable. When the communist system in Eastern Europe collapsed, these countries thought that they would just return to their own cultural pathway, their own cultural development that they have set out for themselves historically in the 1920s. They thought they would just return basically to the 1920s, would forge the same alliances, and would try to go along that path. But they didn't realize that while they stayed in the communist system, they experienced basically what was a cultural freezer. So whereas in Eastern Europe, in terms of culturally speaking, not so many things have changed. The countries of Western Europe became entirely different in that period because they got entirely subverted. Now, the Soviet Union was a system that relied way too much on hard power. The Soviet Union's power projection was basically based entirely on hard power, and so it didn't bind the countries of Eastern Europe to itself by anything else than soldiers being present there, right? And once that system collapsed, they reoriented towards the West. But again, in the West, the United States actually was not only governing it by military power; they subverted the entire culture. They changed everything upside down. And it took a long while for Eastern Europeans to realize that they cannot just resume where their own history, where it stopped when communism occupied that region. They cannot do that anymore. So they need to think of themselves now as a different kind of Europeans, a kind of Europeans that needs their own overarching structure, which is not to be found in the European Union.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah, I think that sums up pretty good. And I'll also, just to bring things back around, to sort of put the previous two topics together, I saw a headline, I think it was Reuters, one of these mainstream outlets, and they said that Macron and Viktor Orban of Hungary, were the, quote, frenemies shaking Europe to the core. Do you think there's any potential of these Visegrad countries, who you would think, at least in theory, oppose the American-led order, oppose the European Union, at least in its current form, and someone like Macron, who's probably the closest thing to a solid opposition, as I said it was, do you think there's any weight to that, or do you think that's just a mainstream media headline?
I think we would have a lot of potential if we combined France's economic and military power with Hungary's cultural policy. That would be a way forward. Now, what I would like to say is Orban is probably the only politician within the European Union that I actually like, because I'm kind of skeptical about, let's say, Salvini or the other right-wing populists, so-called, or especially the PIS government in Poland, which are total Zionist cucks. But if you look at Orban, actually, like, Orban does things that matter. What I observe with all these right-wing populists is they talk a lot, but they do very little things that, you know, have actual real-world material effects. Whereas Orban is the only politician within the European Union that is a bit reminiscent of Putin, in that he actually managed to ban NGOs, Western NGOs, from working in Hungary, like all of Soros's NGOs, and I think USAID also, and things like that. He then closed this George Soros University. So he is actually enacting practical things, and he also closed the border with an actual fence. Like, he is the much better Trump, because he actually does what he says. But he doesn't have the power to unilaterally, quit the EU, because Hungary is a small country with a small population, not a very strong economy, a small army. So his reforms are also hanging by a thread. Once they manage to replace Orban with someone else, that is all going to come down, because Hungary doesn't have the hard power to maintain this kind of order. That's the bad thing. You would basically need the power of a country like France to keep that up. So those two countries combined would be kind of cool, but I don't know whether that's the way that things are going to go.
I think there's definitely more potential than, say, even just 2 years ago. I mean, despite the disappointment with Trump, despite the fact that he really hasn't taken any domestic or foreign policy major deviations, what he represents culturally, what he represents just as what the elite at least feared he would do, notice the past tense there, I think it sort of opened a window as to, or I think it sort of presented an opportunity of just the slightest bit of instability could lead to things that could be much greater, or could just result in American reassertion in Europe. But
Right. In a sense, the myth of Trump is more important than actual Trump.
yes,
I totally agree with that statement. And the problem with Macron is, again, I already said he's one of the very few politicians in Europe that actually talks about interesting things, talks about changing the order we currently have. But what I just said, he does very, very little to materialize that. That's my main problem. Like, Orban actually does things, and Macron is actually talking about interesting things, but he does all the things you would expect from a Goldman Sachs banker, basically.
Right. I think also, there might be an element that Macron is aware of where the tides are changing, and as you said earlier, that that there is a stronger French impulse towards independence, and that Macron's reaching out to Russia and in a tacit way to Hungary reflect the kind of pragmatism that is setting in. And in that respect, France is kind of, because of its leadership position, in a way, it can't afford to instigate those kinds of changes. Hungary flies under the radar, and in that way, because it's not looked at, a potential adversary, or even if it became a Russian satellite state, which I'm fully aware it never will.
Yeah, geographically,
it doesn't present a challenge. So I guess, long story short, I think Macron's hands are tied, and he can't do those things because of France's prominent position in the EU and in the Western world. However, I think all his gestures lately, to me, indicate someone who's aware that there's an economic downturn that's occurring in the EU, in Europe, and that this is an opportunity for France to stake out, a greater independence and a greater leadership role than it would have alone and solely within the EU. So,
I think what you're trying to say is that Macron is a Duganist.
Essentially a Eurasianist.
I again agree that we are getting interesting indicators from France, but what I'm still waiting for are actual developments in France. I'm only going to praise Macron if he actually does something. Like, that's for me, that's the thing I'm waiting for now. Like, I don't want another Trump who has a base Twitter account but does nothing. I will start evaluating Macron's policy when he, for example, it only takes, at least legally, it only takes one European country to, to disagree, to prolong the sanctions on Russia, for example, and then the entire bloc has to drop them, essentially. So they need to be enacted unilaterally, else they don't work, at least according to European law. So Macron could do that, for example, say, must not be reliant on the United States, or we must not be the executors of their foreign policy. Therefore, France will not support any further sanctioning Russia, and we also will not support sanctioning Iran, for example. Now, when he does that, that will be a major sea change, and then I will say, okay, Macron actually is a very interesting politician, but for now it's all talk, no action. So therefore, yeah, indicators might be interesting. Maybe he's waiting for something, but whether that is going to materialize, I'm not going to get excited before I see actual things happening.
Right, but I think the reason France can't move is, I would say, twofold. One is the counter to any kind of movement, the kind of developments that you pointed out that you wish you could see, right? That would contradict France in the way that is narratively viewed now, right? In that, France is propped up as, along with America, as the two revolutionary countries that established the traditions of the neo-liberal democratic order and so on. And in a way that it's far more entrenched now, narratively speaking. I won't get into substantively speaking, much more so than in Gaull's time. And so this would present itself as a kind of contradiction, so much so that it would be a media fodder. And
yeah.
this is why he can't budge. He cannot seem like he's going to overhaul France, that he's going to go against the liberal tradition. When Bush Jr. Wanted to go into Iraq, and he was...
Oh, I knew you were going to bring this up. I was actually just about to if you weren't. But continue.
Right. So Condoleezza Rice kind of broke things down on a very macro level, geopolitics and civilizational ideas. She said that Russia refusing to do it, Russia has to be ignored, is still essentially a child, but that France not willing to go was a betrayal. And I would argue that position now is even more entrenched, because it's looked at as the co-daughter to this revolution. But why don't you? I'm wildly paraphrasing, Constantine. So why don't you finish it off?
What it was is, on the eve of the invasion of Iraq, as you set up, the countries they petitioned, the three major ones, were the UK, Germany, France, and Russia. The UK accepted, so they had to be thanked. Russia rejected, but they took the position they had to be sort of forgiven because they, as you said, they were viewed as a child, like they don't know any better. They'll eventually come around, which we see how that turned out. Germany had to be ignored because it was part of the old guard, it was part of the old order. It was the has-been. It doesn't matter what they are anymore. Or France had to be chastised because it had its enlightenment, it had its revolution, but it betrayed it.
That's right.
I perfectly agree with you that France is still too entrenched in the current system. But then, why are we even discussing Macron as an interesting politician? Why does he differ from Merkel then? Other than in his rhetoric?
Well, because in some ways rhetoric does matter. In the same way that the myth of Trump matters more than the actual Trump. In the way that it set a panic, right? In the way that these ideas became public.
I think that Macron is sensing that trouble is on the horizon for the current system. He's not opposed to the current system. He's part of the global liberal elite. He's a former Goldman Sachs banker, again, for hell's sake, right? So I think he doesn't want to revolutionize the system. I think he wants to preserve it, but he sees that clinging to the United States might not be the way forward for liberal Europe. That's the problem.
Yeah, that's
right. I don't disagree with any of that.
Yeah, so I don't know. Again, yes, sure, Macron is very, very interesting. His rhetoric is interesting, but that's my final point essentially about him. I just can't get excited about him before I see that he is an actual change agent. For now, he's not a real change agent. That's the problem.
Yeah, I would agree on that point, especially after the Iran debacle was actually really his time to shine, where Europe could have completely ignored the U.S. when it came to we need to re-implement sanctions after some of the disasters, January this year, December last year, where France, leading a European bloc, could have said, no, we're not bowing to your will. But we saw how that turned out. Even France ended up re-implementing some of the sanctions. But how I wanted to finish out, since we are running a little bit up on time here, is Iran and the potential of an conflict with the United States. And do you? I'm not gonna ask how you think that would play out, but do you think, in a roundabout way, in an accelerationist way, a U.S. war with Iran, them getting bogged down in another Middle Eastern conflict with a country of that caliber, would, in the long run, benefit what your goals would be?
That's a hard question, to be honest, because on the one hand, I probably think that if the United States went to actual war with Iran and tried to occupy that country in any way, that would end up as a disaster for the United States, much more so than Iraq, for example, because Iran is an entirely different beast. They would basically need their entire army, or they would need to reinstitute conscription. Now, of course, I do think that they would, with relative ease, I mean, they would have some trouble for sure to defeat the regular Iranian army. But if they wanted to keep that country occupied, now that would require a lot of military force. And that's an investment they cannot take. That would basically bankrupt them. This would bankrupt their actual hard power. So I'm very skeptical of them going into this war. Now, however, I want them to go to war. Actually, no, I think when the recent assassination of General Soleimani happened, I was very opposed to any further escalation on behalf of the United States. Although some Russian nationalists actually, they took the position like, we don't care about Iran. If the US wants to fight them, that's good for us because, well, it will drive the oil prices up, and then the United States will get bogged down in a mess they can't really get out. So that would be good for Russia in some people's opinion. But as for me, I think the Achilles heel of the US global world order is basically Israel. It's in the Middle East because it forces them to act irrationally, basically. If the US wasn't interested in Israel, they would abandon it because it's an outpost that their empire doesn't really need. It costs them a lot and has no real benefits for them. So any rational empire that was centered in, let's say, Washington, D.C., it would abandon Israel. It wouldn't care for that. But because the America is basically run by Israeli elites, they have to orient their foreign policy towards that tiny strip of land in the Middle East, and it forces them to be extremely irrational. So, as a great power player, So in the long term, I think the United States empire will be brought down more efficiently by forcing them to be Israel's henchmen, basically, because they have to make a lot of investments this way that any self-respecting empire would never make. That they're going to be very expensive for them. Like Israel is basically like 10 Vietnams for the United States all the time, every single day. Their entire Middle East policy is like 10 Vietnams all the time, basically. So that's why I support Iran staying up and staying strong, because as long as Iran exists, people in Tel Aviv will continue to schwitz, and that is going to force the United States to continue their foreign policy of blunders, basically. And I think this way they're going to lose. Whereas if they would go to a direct war with Iran, that would probably cause a lot of chaos that might not be very beneficial to Russia, let's say.
So you actually bring a point that we have now. When the Soleimani assassination happened, we did a show almost immediately afterwards, and we speculated that there wouldn't be a conventional war that involved actually destroying the Iranian military capacity in an occupation, which would be bloody and require more manpower, probably conscription at that point. We speculated that would be a war fought in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon with Hezbollah, and even in Yemen. And it seems like what you just said, it's going there, where the U.S. will sanction Lebanon or support Israel's actions against Hezbollah or keep this occupation force in Syria or continue the quote-unquote fight against ISIS in Iraq or keep on intervening in Yemen to constrain Iranian influence in the region, and all of which from, as you said, an empire based in Washington D.C. are very irrational moves. And funny you
We
bring that up. Just not to get off on too much tangent, but it is interesting that even as recent as George Bush Sr., he sort of told the Israelis off when it came to Middle Eastern politics because he had the old mind of an oil tycoon where he wanted to defend the Gulf states. He wanted to put their interests first for the sake of global oil prices and American domination of Middle Eastern oil. But it seems like you were getting at the point we were sort of making a few weeks back, just in general.
Yeah, I think we are finishing the podcast, right? I have one more point I would like to
Yeah,
make.
go ahead if you want to get one
Okay,
last point.
because we can actually finish on a white pill because if you look
excellent.
at that, we must not forget that actually the United States empire is losing right now because in my living memory, okay, I'm not that old, but whatever, like for a very long period of time when I was growing up, let's say. The United States never lost. Future was very predictable. History actually ended because if you kind of knew what the US was up to, you could, with quite a lot of certainty, predict where things would be going, right? You could perfectly predict that the United States would invade Iraq and would occupy it. You could perfectly predict that they would overthrow Muammar Gaddafi, and so forth and so forth. Every color revolution was a success. Things were going in a unidirectional way. But they stopped doing so around maybe 2008. That was the first time I noticed that Russia emerged as a player on the scene again, when they didn't allow the United States to have their gay op in Georgia. That was the first thing, but it was a very minor move, but nonetheless quite historical. Then in 2014, when Russia reclaimed Crimea, for example, and then the final culmination, Russia's intervention in the Middle East, which prevented them for the first time from getting the piece of the chessboard that they wanted. They didn't get Syria. It was an entire failure. They had to actually remove a lot of troops already. And then within that whole quagmire again, because the United States is always forced to commit mistakes because of Israel, and that's brilliant. They lost Turkey because they had staged this coup against Erdogan that fortunately failed, which alienated him from US power because Erdogan was a sovereigntist, and then they had to invest a lot of their political capital in the YPG, in Kurdish terrorists that Turkey is at odds with. And Turkey in that region is much more valuable than fucking Israel. Israel is a tiny strip of land that's completely worthless. Turkey is the second largest military in NATO, and a very big roadblock for Russia in terms of its access to the Mediterranean and other things like that, right? And they alienated even Turkey because they always commit tactical blunders, and they will withdraw from Syria. They will lose in Syria. That will be the first war in my memory that the United States project for their global empire where it's failed, and they're going to continue to fail, and it will escalate and accelerate. So we are on a very optimistic path, I would say. That's what I would like to finish with.
Strong finish there, and clocking in at a regular War Report episode time. I think we did pretty good. Pretty interesting. I'm not sure whether this will be the episode for this week or whether we'll put on one covering the events of the week. So heads up, you might get 2 episodes this week. This might be the only one. I'm a bit busy with some things, so this has been enjoyable, though. I think we had a very interesting discussion. If you ever want to come back on again, we can set that up. It may take another 6 months, but nonetheless, it will get done because I'm a man of my word. And thank you, everyone, for tuning into the War Report. We'll see you next time, and goodbye.
Thank you.